G'day friends, good to be with you, and thank you for clicking on this video. I think this is going to be a good one. Let me just start off and say to you that when I started ministry, started out as a pastor of a church. Me and my wife, we pastored a church in the west of Johannesburg for a few years, just over a decade. Due to the fact that I was in an environment where there was a lot of cults, there was a lot of Muslims, I got involved with Muslim evangelism like a good pastor, like a good church that needs to reach out. Quickly realized the need, quickly realized that there is definitely merit in what we're doing. We could see the fruit of the ministry. And so this ministry was born. And so let me just say, I acknowledge with all my heart that Discernment Ministries in and of itself is necessary. I acknowledge the fact that some of them have good intentions, and obviously it is to protect the church of false teaching. If we could give a very broad definition to Discernment Ministries, I would say it's organizations or individuals who see their primary role as evaluating or critiquing and exposing doctrinal error. They look at false teaching, and they look at certain unbiblical practices within the church. And they often focus on theology, they often focus on spiritual movements, they often focus on specific teachers. They look at certain church trends, and what they do is just they aim to break that down, and they aim to protect believers from this deception, and they try to uphold sound doctrine. That being said, we can see quite clearly, and maybe this is an interesting point to state, that very early on in church history, we can see that there was, especially of the earliest Christian fathers from the first century, we could see that there was theological critiques that were driven, and it existed in the earliest Christian fathers. And I'm thinking specifically of somebody like Irenaeus, who wrote his Against Heresies about 180 AD. I'm thinking of, I'm just going to flex through church history, but I'm thinking of Martin Luther, John Calvin. We can trace the roots of defending the faith quite substantially, and I think a good case could be brought forward where we can see quite clearly that this has always been part of the church. This has always been somewhere in the church, somebody spoke out against what they perceived to be one form or one practice they deemed to be heresy. It's also interesting to note that heresy is usually associated with what people believe about the sufficiency of God, salvation, and specific doctrines that would influence and change what is the obvious teaching of the text. Now, that being said, sometimes it means we need to study, sometimes it means we need to mull through certain things. And I don't want to bore or overburden the point that I want to make today surrounding these ministries, but let me just say that in the early 80s and 90s, I was still not that old, but I can remember that there was this early awakening of thinking of books like Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults. I was working through this. I'm thinking of somebody like who I have great respect for. Maybe I shouldn't say it because some discernment ministries won't like this, but somebody like a Norman Geisler, Ron Rhodes. Excellent books that I started reading. Maybe I should show you a few others more, not to brag or anything. Somebody like John MacArthur, Charismatic Chaos. Don't agree with everything of MacArthur because he's a cessationist, and I'm not. Somebody like a Hank Hanegraaff. I've got appreciation for all of these individuals that have, in some form or another, tried to steer the ship, and they try to bring to light what we could see in tele-evangelism, especially in America, the early 80s. I'm looking at Jim Baker, the fall of Jimmy Swaggart, and other individuals that were placed under theological scrutiny. And so we can see in the 80s with some of these individuals and others, I might have missed a few, you can comment in the comment section, but we could see quite clearly that there was this momentum that built Christian radio programs, newsletters, websites devoted to critique ministries from these major platforms. And then obviously with the explosion of the digital age and expansion of the digital age in the early 2000s, this just made these ministries blow up. I'm thinking of YouTube channels. I'm looking at Pirate Christian Radio, Pulpit and Pen. I'm looking at there were so many individuals that started to critique churches, and it seemed like Discernment Ministries took on a different form. It seemed like people had voices to speak, they afforded themselves platforms to give their opinions, and ultimately they brought themselves to a place where that was the specific aim of their ministries. It's not like somebody like Michael Horton, who wrote The Agony of Deceit, but he also wrote The Gospel and Mission, just to give an example. There's a few others as well. It seemed like a lot of people were absolutely consumed, not to preach the gospel, but to discern other people and to discern ministries. And again, like I said, there's a biblical mandate for this. 1 John 4:1, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits. And Acts chapter 17:11, the Bereans were praised for examining the scriptures. In Titus 1:9, the church leaders are instructed to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. 2 Timothy 4 verse 2 to 4, where Paul encourages Timothy to both rebuke and to reprove and to exhort. These verses and obviously history tells us quite clearly that there is absolutely merit for what is happening. But let me tell you something changed. Everybody was under scrutiny. I mean, you can take any name of a major evangelical or a major preacher, and you will find that in some way or in some form of another, they've actually been scrutinized. And let me give you a few names. I thought I'll give you some which are in the news now, and I don't know, maybe I'll use their quotes just to aggravate you a little bit. But I'm thinking of Billy Graham. Remember, somebody that I think is the absolute immense force of gospel preaching and the epitome of evangelical preaching, somebody like an evangelical leader like Billy Graham, where some people just absolutely criticized his ecumenical outreach and his cooperation with Catholics and mainline Protestants, where people said, you dare to speak to these individuals, or you dare to speak in these groups. And so they believed he was compromising the gospel. Okay. I'm thinking yesterday of somebody that I really like that has recently received a lot of flack. I look at the comments and sometimes the videos that are being made by this individual, and I go, Lord, help us. If this is what Discernment Ministries are doing, help us. But look at somebody like Francis Chan. You know, Francis Chan obviously has built relationship with some Pentecostal and charismatic leaders. He's appeared alongside with them at different conferences, and some Discernment Ministries have declared Francis Chan is the one that is departed from the faith. Let me give you another one, which might be in the Reformed circle a while back. John Piper. You search on the internet, you can see quite clearly that he was criticized for his views on Christian hedonism and his view, specifically his views on complementarianism. And he was called out by a broad range of online critics, saying that Piper has not stood the time of being faithful to Reformed and evangelical theology, and he should be shunned. Let me give you another one. This is a controversial one for various reasons, but somebody like a Rick Warren, who wrote a book called Purpose-Driven Life, who is branded as being seeker-sensitive and one that we should steer away from and stay clear from. Now, that's a little bit controversial, but I'll give it. What about Nabil Qureshi? I can remember before the passing of Nabil Qureshi, I was in correspondence. He would have been my master's thesis overseer. He would have been the guy that would mark me, and he was on his way to South Africa and then unfortunately received the news of his disease, which ultimately took his life. All of these individuals have been criticized, and then there are some that where criticism wasn't necessary, right? We could see, for instance, what happened with Dr. Ravi Zacharias, which pains me still today, what happened with him, and there's other respected leaders as well, which we can mention by name in the charismatic and the Pentecostal world, and we can basically say, you know what, these guys missed it, and obviously they sinned, and obviously disqualified themselves from ministry. But I want to speak a little bit today about Discernment Ministries, because what we see is that they are still on the rise, they're still out there, and there seems to be a lot of these ministries out there that lack 7 things, which I think we should look at. And so I want to look at these things just to clearly portray and speak to you about what should we look out for when we listen to these discernment ministries. And how should we evaluate them? Because they should also be evaluated. They should not be free from the criticism they afford to others. And I speak for myself included. I've had people that criticized my ministry, criticized the fact that I'm a Pentecostal, I'm a charismatic. I've had people criticize me because I associate with certain individuals. I had somebody one day phone me and say to me, "Why are you spending time with prophet so-and-so?" And I said, because I've got an ear with him and I can speak to him. And I believe the conversation and the relationship is mutually beneficial. And they didn't like that. They said, no, you should shun him and you should expose him and you should make more videos about him and you should tell people they should not go to his church. And I said, I will not do anything like that. That is divisive and that's not the biblical way to do this. And I'll include in just at the bottom here on the comment section, I will include some of the articles I've written to explain exactly why. But today I want to specifically look at these discerners that come out and discern everybody else. Now let me give you 7 things which I believe is problematic when we look at these supposed discernment ministries. And the first one is the lack of accountability. Now, it's interesting, but when we look at some discernment ministries, many of them operate anonymously without any ecclesiastical oversight. No one is allowed to correct them, and no one is allowed to say anything about them, but they love to say everything about everybody else. Now, I'm going to give you a quote from somebody very controversial, but Dr. Michael Brown, in actual fact, wrote about this a while back, and he says that these online discernment sites operate anonymously with no public accountability. And listen to what he says, because I think even though what happened with Dr. Michael Brown recently and your opinion on Dr. Brown, what he said is still true. And so he says the following. He says, they malign and misrepresent others online, yet they cannot be corrected or rebuked. No one can call them to account, not their pastor or their denomination or peers or their elders, because no one knows who they are. And they are supposed to be correcting the body by what? Authority. In other words, when these ministries name leaders without oversight, they themselves escape correction often. And I've seen some of these individuals spread false information. And they are individuals that basically want to speak their opinion, but very often they are anonymous to anyone. And so they escape any form of criticism themselves. So Dr. Brown also says they color everything with their own interpretations and give priority to sensationalism rather than edification. And let me just say to you guys, a lack of accountability breeds very poor standards when it comes to individuals that try to critique the body of Christ. Imagine a shepherd who rebukes the sheep without being part of the flock himself. It just cannot work. Friends, now secondly, I want to speak about something else. Look out for those that have a harsh or combative tone. You know, it's interesting that in a lot of these apologetics and research ministries, and I say ministries tongue-in-cheek, but what we see is a lot of young men, a lot of testosterone, a lot of desire to fight the fight. And let me just say that tone matters as much as truth. Any public rebuke without gentleness becomes slander. I know a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people say, no, you should sort them out. Listen, I'm from a Dutch background. If you know anything about the Dutch South Africans, all of us are boxers and all of us like a good fight. I've been in a few myself, lost a few, but I won a few. And the one thing that I can say when it comes to church and discernment ministries is very simply that when it comes to sharing truth without love, you won't have any effect in your ministry. You will have a lot of people offended. You'll shock a lot of people. You'll have 1 or 2 people that limp towards your direction, but ultimately your ministry will be void without any fruit. Joel Beakey, it's interesting, he was in South Africa once, and I was at a Reformed bookshop, and I was busy buying books, and he actually came in, and very friendly guy. He spoke to me. I met him because of his gentleness and respect towards me. I was the only guy in the bookshop, and asked me where I'm from. I think maybe he thought I worked at the bookshop, but I was actually shopping. He speaks specifically about ministers and especially individuals and cautions them to balance truth with love. And I want to read to you what he says. He says the following. He says, many ministers, and you can put in that also many internet trolls, have focused too much on polemical and apologetic theology, often setting up and beating upon straw men in their congregation to the deriment of the flock. He argues that truth must be ultimately positive in nature, and that error should be exposed wisely, forthrightly, but also humbly, not by lording it over the sheep. I like that. I like the fact that he speaks about this gentleness which should be evident in our ministries. It's quite sad. I've had an individual that probably knows more about Hadith and Islam online than anybody else that I know. And his attitude and his ministry is unfortunately marred by his absolute gracelessness and his efforts to offend people back into truth. Let me just say that that type of attitude and ministry will get you nowhere. Underlines of combative and arrogant tone will undermine the gospel. Whereas I would say that correction tempered with compassion will bring people to the truth. It's interesting that Joel Beakey says the following. He says, Jesus corrected with truth and tears. Are we imitating him? Another writer and commentator, Bill Muhlenberg, pleads with these zealous heresy hunters to exercise humility. And he writes the following. He says, I plead with all the heresy hunters out there, and undoubted some folk will think that I'm one, to be prayerful, careful, and humble as you stand for truth. And then he adds that while heresy does harm the church, it also harms by overzealous, unwise, uncaring, and unloving heresy hunters. Number 3, I want to speak to you about something else that these discernment ministries jump on, which is really just incredible. I speak about guilt by association. Now, this usually happens when somebody is afforded to be judged by these heresy hunters because they simply spoke at a specific conference, or they spoke to a specific individual, or they dared to reach out to a specific individual. For me, that is just simply intellectually lazy. Tim Charlies, author and blogger, he says the following. He says, the trap of guilt by association is a common pitfall for these ministries. He says the following. He explains that it is unfair and illogical to suppose that a relationship between two people is a blanket endorsement of all the other person writes or teaches. So in his words, some critics are lazy in their discernment. Rather to evaluate the teacher's actual beliefs, they simply condemn him because he's friends and he associates with somebody controversial. I can remember years back, I was asked to speak at a specific church, and the individual I spoke at was a very well-known African apostle, and the building I spoke in and the place I spoke in was packed. There was, I can't remember how many people, but thousands. And I had an opportunity to share the gospel, and a lot of people criticized it and said, how can you go speak in this place amongst these people? They do A, B, C wrong. And I said, that's exactly where I need to be. And it's quite amazing to see people criticizing that which they are not willing to do. But Tim Charlies here warns that this fallacy assumes someone is wrong by the virtue simply of their association. And he says if discernment ministries do this, it is a way to blacken, or it's a way to discard whatever the other person is doing in their ministries at the expense of the person they do not like to be associated with. Muhlenberg echoes this point when he states bluntly that just because a Christian may have a loose association with someone dubious with theological beliefs does not mean that he too is theologically liberal or worse. This guilt by association, Muhlenberg says, is a cheap shot and easy to do. When we take Christian authors or Christian writers and we take individual people that we love, and then because they've spoken to somebody controversial, or they're at a conference, or maybe they even go to that person's church and speak, we immediately cancel them. We immediately demand that they resign all their faculties, and we immediately demand that they step down from the pulpit because they just went and spoke in a specific place. I think that's absurd. I can remember a few years back, a very well-known and notable leader went and he spoke to Mormons. And man, what a backlash he received. And I thought to myself, where else would you expect Peter and Paul to be? In the Areopagus, Acts 17, amongst the Stoic philosophers, amongst the Epicureans. But yet, in these discernment ministries, people are guilty because they dare to speak to other people and not just about other people. Friends, number 4, I want to speak to you about poor theological methodology. This is when these individual ministries simply try to find things that they can marginalize, something they can use for clickbait. I usually call them gotcha moments. And people that pursue these little sound bites to create some biblical credibility, they are in the forefront of abuse. Now, let me be very honest with you. I've got a few videos on my own channel where I take on specific cults, where I take what they said and I will take the video and I'll put the video in the description, and I will show you exactly what the individual said in a specific context. On my blogs, I write specifically about these cults and I'll show you exactly what is problematic with what they said. But never will I take somebody and simply take them out of context just to get a selective quote or a gotcha moment. Bill Muhlenberg criticized how some of these online critics concerned and conduct themselves when they search and destroy. He calls it search and destroy investigations. And he observes that they often engage in, and I quote, selective quoting or quoting out of context, laboring to find one damning phrase or sentence out of a million of words of someone's life and work, and then exclaim, aha, gotcha, disprove you are a heretic. Well, friends, let me just say that such tactics ignore nuance, it twists words, it makes modest disagreements look like criminal errors. And again, Dr. Michael Brown similarly wrote an article, and he says that glorified gossip columns, they repeat the latest accusations almost with glee, often believing the worst rather than to give the benefit of the doubt. And then obviously he laments that these supposed seekers points to biblical exegesis that is sound. And as he puts it, often it's the sensationalism that trumps response and methodology. The critics simply use lifting quotes in the worst possible light. Friends, we should not attempt to do that. We should not do that. We should not take people's words simply to create clickbait. And I've seen this often. I've seen people make little videos to get that YouTube channel growing and to create a viewership that can give them some bread on the table to eat. That is not fair. We should not do that, and we should hold ourselves to higher standards. Well, friends, point number 5. Let me speak to you about the neglect of the gospel. There's some of these online ministries that spend a lot of energy attacking error, but man, they never proclaim the hope of the gospel. For them, polemics have become the main meal instead of the seasoning of the course. Joel Beeke stresses that the voice of the sheep should carry the gospel first. And then he goes on to counsel us that ministers should emphasize teaching positive truth, and polemics should be the minor accent to the main message. If you are in a discernment ministry or if you're a pastor, you need to make sure that what you say feed the flock with the gospel. And please stop waging endless doctrinal battles. And I've seen this online. I've seen people that try to create endless wars. They quote endless people by name simply to create a YouTube following and to create some views. Jared C. Wilson, pastor and author, he likewise contrasts love with relentless criticism, and he says the following. He says, the world will know we are Christians not by our loathing, but our love. He goes further and he says, we cannot afford to keep turning on each other and condemning each other over second and third order doctrines. Watch out for individuals that try to consistently cause harm to ministries and churches. And watch out for people that try to neglect sharing Christ's grace. Point number 6, sensationalism and fear-mongering. You listen, in the age of YouTube, where there is such a pressure on people to create unique content to be viewed, ask yourself before you put that content out there, is this simple clickbait? Is this something just to draw a crowd? Or is this something that is betraying truth in a way that is worthy of our Lord Jesus Christ? Sam Storms, somebody I greatly respect, is a pastor and theologian. He criticizes alarmist rhetoric, especially amongst critics. And he says, give up the exaggerated fear-mongering clickbait posts and focus instead on genuine issues. Critics often inflate matters to scary threats that may not exist, which distracts from constructive gospel work. I can remember in one of his clips, he actually speaks of the fiction of the imaginary boogeyman. He speaks of a fabrication of the NAR or other movements. And he says, I plead with Christians and Discernment Ministries to stop using unhelpful terminology and even sensational claims. By doing so, we really run amok, and what we do is we do not really address abuse, but we become the abuser. Point number 7, treating secondary disagreements as heresy. This is when we take second-tier issues like eschatology or cessationism or miracles, signs and wonders, or spiritual gifts, worship styles. We take those secondary issues and we split the church. There's an excellent book that if you want to get this, man, this is such a good book by Norman Geisler and Ron Rhodes on conviction without compromise. And in the book, they speak about the essentials of the faith, things that desperately need to be upheld in any community or any church, and certain things which we can call secondary, things that will not really make a difference or does not really determine the essential truths of the gospel. And so Tim Charlies observes that the most extreme discerners sometimes elevate minor issues into major sin. I'm not saying major issues. I'm calling them major sins. Dr. Albert Mohler also noted that discernment requires distinguishing between essentials and adiaphora. And he says a discerning person will not allow foundational doctrines of the faith to be lowered to disputable matters. And likewise, they will not allow matters of lesser importance to ascend to utmost importance. Dr. Mohler warns against fundamentalist tendencies to treat every quirk as a gospel-level error. I can remember, and I say this with all due respect, some of my Reformed brothers in America one day sending me a message and saying, if you do not uphold the 5 points of Calvinism, you're a heretic. You cannot be saved. And man, I was thinking to myself, whoa, Lord, if the qualification for the kingdom is tulip, man, then I'm in trouble. Jared C. Wilson explains the misuse of the word heresy. And he writes, unless and until someone actually teaches something heretical, we should not call them a heretic. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen churches and pastors being labeled as heretics simply because maybe they are charismatic, they have a prophetic gift, maybe because they give a word, maybe because they've allowed a woman to speak on their pulpit, they're egalitarian, they're not complementarian. And it amazes me that those things have nothing to do with being heretical. You might disagree with them strongly, but man, there is nothing that makes that individual a false teacher because of those things. So, Jared Wilson says the following. He says, anyone who merely holds a different view on secondary matters like eschatology or worship style remains part of the body of Christ. Sometimes we need to be tolerant of individual people that differ with us. I went to incredible and a very nice Theology Proper conference earlier this year. Well, not earlier, about 2-3 months ago. And I was at a Reformed church. Now, I'm not a reformer. I've got great appreciation for Reformed theology. I attended this conference and it was a great joy. And maybe later this year, there's another conference and I will definitely be, if I can, part of that as well. But I wanted to leave you with this, friends. You know what? Whenever we try to create ministries that is not built upon the essential ingredients of truth, whatever we do will falter. And let me remind you in just saying that whatever we do is for the glory of our Lord and Savior and King Jesus Christ. True biblical discernment in and of itself protects the church, but it does not divide it. I understand the importance of the church being the God's pillar of truth, and I understand and acknowledge that there are different interpretations of biblical texts and practices. I acknowledge the fact that the church has different opinions and interpretations, and I even acknowledge that some of the biblical texts and practices within churches I differ with. But as Lutheran theologian named Rupertus Maldenius writes, we should in essentials have unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity about these non-essential things. Here's a quote of John Calvin I really like. For not all of the articles of doctrine are true of the same sort. Some are so necessary to know that they should be certain and unquestionable by all men as the proper principles of religion. Such are God is one, Christ is God, and the Son of God. Our salvation rests in God's mercy and the like. Among the churches there are other articles of doctrines disputed, which still do not break the unity of faith. We value orthodoxy, but we shun any militancy that would not build the Church of Jesus Christ. I believe in accountability, but I also believe in relationship in truth and love. Francis Chan writes a book that I've read earlier this year called Until Unity. Excellent book. And listen to what he says. Profound quote. He says, we worship a God who desires unity with his children and between his children. He sent his Son to bring his children together under his care. No good father wants to see separation between his children. And as a father of 7, it would crush me to see any of my children rejected and separated from others, and it would anger me to see any of my children being divisive. Friends, we need to do better. Please like and share. Subscribe to this channel if it helps you. I'll talk with you again, and be blessed.